For 14 years, one of the most secure households in Moscow was quietly compromised. Not by hidden microphones, not by intercepted cables, but by a man with dirt under his fingernails, trimming roses beneath open windows. In 1967, when Cold War paranoia had turned Moscow into a city of shadows, a middle-aged laborer arrived carrying a battered suitcase and perfectly ordinary papers. To the officials who glanced at his documents, he was forgettable. To the people who passed him on the street, he barely existed. And that was exactly why he had been chosen. His real name no longer mattered. Inside the Soviet Union, he would live as a widowed agricultural worker from Belarus, a man displaced by bureaucracy, looking for honest work. He had no medals, no education worth mentioning, no ambition beyond survival. On paper, he was invisible. In practice, that invisibility would become the most dangerous weapon American intelligence ever placed inside Moscow. 2 years earlier, analysts in the United States had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Traditional espionage in the Soviet capital was failing. Diplomats were followed, tourists were monitored, apartments were searched, hotels were compromised before guests even unpacked. The KGB expected spies to arrive with briefcases and secrets. What they did not expect was patience. A single insight changed everything. A former Soviet surveillance specialist, now living in the West, explained that senior officials behaved differently at home. Inside private residences, especially gardens, conversations relaxed. Guards lowered their alertness. Doors were left open. Voices carried. The assumption was simple and deadly. No foreign agent could ever get that close. The flaw wasn't technology. It was arrogance. The agency needed someone who could exist inside that blind spot for years without attracting attention. Someone who could work with his hands, keep his head down, and disappear into routine. Someone who could be present every day without ever being remembered. The man they selected had grown up working land. He knew soil, seasons, and silence. He spoke Russian fluently, not like an academic, but like someone shaped by hardship. Psychological assessments described him as patient to an unnatural degree, capable of enduring monotony without frustration, isolation without collapse. Where others sought recognition, he avoided it instinctively. 18 months of preparation followed. He studied Soviet labor culture, agricultural methods, and the rhythms of daily life. He learned how to complain properly, how to wait in lines without drawing attention, how to blend into conversations without leading them. Most importantly, he learned how to think like a man who had never known freedom, and therefore never missed it. By the time he crossed the border into the Soviet Union, his cover was no longer an act. It was a habit. For weeks he worked small jobs across Moscow, fixing fences, cleaning courtyards, helping elderly residents tend neglected plots of land. He lived in cramped communal housing. He attended mandatory meetings. He became familiar, then forgettable, exactly as planned. The opportunity arrived quietly. A senior security official's estate in the Lenin Hills had lost its gardener at the worst possible moment. Early summer. The grounds were deteriorating. The household was irritated. Through informal labor networks, the quiet Belarusian worker's name surfaced. When he was interviewed, there were no grand questions, only practical ones. Trees, soil, disease, seasons. He answered calmly, accurately, without enthusiasm. His knowledge wasn't rehearsed. It was real. 3 days later, he was hired. What no one inside that house realized was that the moment he stepped onto the property, one of the longest and most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War, had already begun. He had no instructions beyond survival, no scheduled extraction, no guarantee he would ever leave. And standing in that garden for the first time, watching the windows above him, he understood one thing with terrifying clarity. If he succeeded, no one would ever notice. If he failed, no one would ever admit he existed. Within weeks, he would hear something he was never meant to hear, something that would prove the mission was already working. If your survival depended on being ignored every single day, how long could you erase yourself before there was nothing left to return to? By the time summer settled over Moscow, the estate no longer felt like unfamiliar ground. It felt dangerous in a quieter way. The property sat behind high walls in one of the city's most protected districts, a place where senior officials retreated from public life. Inside those walls, order mattered. Paths were swept daily. Hedges were symmetrical. Nothing was allowed to appear neglected, not even people. The gardener moved into a small cottage at the edge of the grounds, a leftover structure from before the revolution. 2 rooms, a narrow bed, a stove that worked only when it felt like it. Privacy, however, was absolute, and privacy was rare currency in the Soviet Union. That alone made the position valuable. For the first several months, he did exactly what was expected of him, and nothing more. He worked from before sunrise until the light faded. Roses were cut back and reshaped. Apple trees were pruned properly for the first time in years. A greenhouse that had been slowly rotting was repaired pane by pane. Soil was turned. Beds were replanted. Vegetables began to grow again. He didn't rush. He didn't complain. He didn't ask questions. The household noticed. The official's wife occasionally stepped onto the terrace to observe his work, offering tea, commenting on the transformation. Her approval mattered more than she realized. In these homes, domestic staff were judged less on loyalty than on competence. A worker who caused inconvenience invited scrutiny. A worker who solved problems became part of the scenery. The man of the house appeared less often. When he did, it was usually from a distance, standing near an open door, smoking, surveying the grounds as if inspecting a map. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was brief and impersonal. That suited the gardener perfectly. More important than who spoke was who stopped noticing him. Within weeks, the rhythms of the estate became predictable. Mornings were quiet. Afternoons brought movement. Drivers, deliveries, visitors who arrived with tight expressions and left hours later looking exhausted. Evenings were unpredictable. Sometimes the house went dark early. Other nights, voices carried late into the garden as men lingered over drinks and cigarettes. The gardener learned where to work without appearing to listen. Certain flower beds offered clear lines of sound from the terrace. Some windows were opened without thought once the weather warmed. Conversations drifted outward, fragmented, unguarded, casual in ways they never were in offices or official buildings. No one lowered their voice for the man trimming hedges below. That was the rule of the place. Workers were present, but irrelevant. He never paused when voices began, never turned his head. His hands kept moving, slow and methodical, as if nothing beyond soil and stems existed. At night, alone in his cottage, he reconstructed what he had heard. Names, tones, fragments of argument, committing them to memory with deliberate care. At first, the information was mundane. Schedules, visitors, complaints about other officials, frustration with bureaucracy. nothing that justified the risk he was taking. Then patterns emerged. The same names appeared again and again. Certain visitors came only on specific days. Tension rose and fell in ways that aligned with events unfolding beyond the estate walls. The gardener began to understand that the garden was not a retreat from power. It was where power relaxed. Once every few weeks, he left the estate on his assigned day off. He followed the same route into the city, the same church, the same rituals. Predictability was protection. In a city obsessed with surveillance, routine was the safest camouflage. No instructions came back. None were expected. The mission had been defined long before he arrived. Observe, remember, endure. Months passed. By autumn, the household had fully absorbed him. He was no longer new. He was simply there, the man who kept things in order. When guests strolled the grounds, he worked around them without acknowledgement. When conversations drifted into sensitive territory, no one stopped speaking. That was when he realized something unsettling. The most secure place in Moscow was not guarded by walls or men with weapons. It was protected by assumption. And standing in the soil beneath open windows, the gardener understood that the operation was no longer theoretical. It was active, it was working, and it would only grow more dangerous from here. By the second year, the work no longer ended when his hands stopped moving. The gardener had learned that the real labor began with listening without reacting, without acknowledging that anything had been heard at all. In a place like this, sound carried easily. Footsteps on stone, laughter after tense meetings, the low, controlled voices of men who believed they were finally beyond reach. The terrace doors were the key. When the weather was warm, they were often left open, as if the walls themselves no longer mattered. Conversations spilled into the garden in fragments. Never full briefings, never formal language, but something more revealing. Opinions, frustrations, confidence, fear. He positioned himself carefully, not close enough to seem curious, not far enough to miss what mattered. The work gave him reason to remain in one place for long stretches. Trimming, weeding, repairing borders that didn't truly need repair. His posture never changed. His pace never shifted. Inside his head, everything was being recorded. At night, in the quiet of his cottage, he reconstructed entire exchanges from memory. He had trained for this, breaking conversations into categories, attaching words to images, storing them in a mental order that could survive exhaustion. Names were anchored to movements, emotions to tone, intent to context. It was slow, it was imperfect, but over time, it became reliable. The first genuinely valuable information came without drama. A small gathering, lunch on the terrace, 3 men, relaxed enough to joke. The gardener worked nearby, raking leaves that had already been gathered once. One name surfaced repeatedly, spoken casually, almost carelessly. A man positioned abroad, a man with access, a man described with quiet satisfaction. The gardener did not know who that person was. He did not need to. His task was not interpretation. It was capture. Weeks later, when he followed his routine into the city and left his coded note where it belonged, analysts thousands of miles away recognized the significance immediately. A thread they had suspected, but never confirmed, was suddenly visible. The garden had spoken. From that point on, the operation settled into a rhythm that was both sustainable and unbearable. Days of physical labor, evenings of silent recall, weeks of waiting, then repetition. What made the work effective was also what made it dangerous. He was not stealing documents. He was not planting devices. He was not altering anything. There were no traces to find because nothing was being done. That meant there was also nothing to stop him. The household's trust deepened without effort. The official's wife began consulting him on plant choices. Guests complimented the grounds in his presence without addressing him directly. He received occasional praise, then was ignored again. That oscillation, momentary acknowledgement followed by erasure, became its own kind of psychological pressure. He had to remain emotionally flat. Gratitude without warmth, humility without servility. Any deviation from the expected behavior of a working man would stand out. Too much curiosity would be suspicious. Too much withdrawal would feel wrong. So he learned balance. He learned when to speak and when silence was safer. When to appear slow. When to appear tired. When to be present just long enough to be useful, and no longer. Over time, the information changed in character. Conversations grew heavier. Names carried more weight. References were made to places far beyond Moscow. Sometimes voices dropped, but not enough. Sometimes they laughed at things that made no sense without context. He learned to recognize moments of stress, raised voices, abrupt departures, a sudden silence where discussion had been flowing freely minutes earlier. Those moments mattered as much as words. During major events beyond the estate, the tone inside the garden shifted. Confidence hardened, anxiety surfaced. Anger appeared where certainty once lived. The gardener could not see the broader picture, but he could feel its pressure passing through the people who shaped it. That perspective, quiet, unfiltered, unguarded, was rare. But with value came risk. The longer he remained, the more routine worked against him. The more he became part of the landscape, the easier it was to forget he was there, and the more catastrophic it would be if someone suddenly remembered. He could not afford illness, could not afford mistakes, could not afford curiosity directed toward him. Every night, as he lay in the narrow bed of his cottage, he replayed the day not as memory, but as inventory. What was heard, what was missed, what might matter later. The garden gave him access no operative was ever meant to have, but it demanded something in return. It required him to disappear so completely that even he began to wonder where the man beneath the cover had gone. Time did not pass evenly inside the estate. It accumulated. Years blurred together, marked less by dates than by seasons. Summers brought open windows and careless conversations. Winters sealed the house behind thick glass and silence, forcing the gardener to rely on fragments. Raised voices, sudden visitors, changes in routine. Snow made everything quieter, heavier. Even words seemed weighed down by the cold. By the 5th year, the work had transformed him physically. His hands were permanently rough. His back carried a constant ache. His movements had slowed, not from age alone, but from the discipline of never appearing hurried. Speed attracted attention. Slowness faded into the background. That invisibility came at a cost. He spoke less than he once had, not out of caution, but habit. Days passed where the only words he exchanged were practical ones, requests for tools, brief, acknowledgments, routine instructions. At night, silence pressed in from all sides. The cottage, once a refuge, began to feel like a sealed compartment. To remain intact, he developed rituals. Each evening, he reviewed the day methodically. He sorted conversations by tone rather than content. Calm meant confidence. Anger meant pressure. Jokes often concealed anxiety. Over time, he learned to read what was not said. Silence after certain names. Abrupt changes of subject. Meetings that ended earlier than expected. Those absences were signals. The household changed gradually. Staff rotated. Drivers came and went. Visitors aged, disappeared, returned in different roles. But the core remained. The man he worked for rose in importance, and with that rise came heavier conversations. More people, more late nights, more tension bleeding into the garden. The gardener adapted without ever acknowledging the shift. He learned which areas of the grounds offered the best acoustics in different weather. Rain distorted sound. Snow absorbed it. Wind could either carry voices perfectly or erase them entirely. He adjusted his tasks accordingly, choosing work that justified his presence near key locations without repetition that might seem deliberate. Once a month, he left the estate and performed the same ritual in the city. The same route, the same timing. Routine was now a shield, but it was also a trap. Any deviation could draw attention, any consistency could be tracked. He assumed he was being watched. That assumption governed everything. How long he stayed in one place, where he sat, which shops he entered. He learned to behave as though surveillance was constant, even when there was no proof. Over time, the behavior became automatic. Then came the internal review. It began quietly. Subtle questions asked of staff. Documents checked again. Interviews conducted without explanation. The kind of process that was never announced and never accidental. When officers entered his cottage, they did not threaten. They did not accuse. They asked ordinary questions in careful ways. About his past, his habits, his health, his opinions. He answered without haste. His story held because it was not elaborate. He had built it from truths rearranged, rather than inventions stacked on top of each other. Farming knowledge could not be faked. The exhaustion in his body could not be rehearsed. When the officers left, nothing had changed. That was worse than relief. From that moment on, he understood that survival depended on something deeper than caution. It required authenticity, not of identity, but of behavior. He could not act like a gardener. He had to be one completely. Years passed. The Cold War shifted phases. Tensions rose and softened. Outside the estate, history accelerated. Inside it, days repeated themselves with suffocating consistency. The garden continued to give him access. But the longer he remained buried inside routine, the harder it became to remember why he was there at all. By the time a decade had passed, the strain was no longer abstract. The gardener's body had carried the mission longer than anyone had planned. Years of bending, lifting, working through snow and rain had left their marks. His hands stiffened in the mornings. Cold settled into his joints and stayed there. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the same mental routine he could no longer shut off. Replaying voices, ordering details, checking for errors that might not exist. He told himself this was manageable. Fatigue could be hidden. Pain could be worked through. Weakness, however, was dangerous. In places like this, illness invited attention. Despite that, the operation continued to deliver value. Conversations grew heavier as the political climate shifted again. Confidence gave way to suspicion. There were more discussions about internal threats, about loyalty, about enemies who were already inside the system. The irony never escaped him. He was standing in plain view while men debated how to find someone exactly like him. The estate remained a hub. Meetings stretched late into the night. The garden lights stayed on longer than they once had. When windows were opened for air, voices drifted out carrying tension rather than ease. There was less laughter now, more argument, more unease. He listened, he remembered, he endured, but the cost accumulated quietly. There were days when dizziness forced him to sit longer than he should have. Days when pain sharpened his focus, instead of dulling it, making every sound feel amplified. He learned to hide this too, moving more slowly, adjusting his tasks so no one noticed strain. Then came the collapse. It happened without warning, in the most ordinary way possible. One moment he was working among the rose bushes, performing a task he had done thousands of times. The next, pain tore through his chest with a force that erased everything else. The ground rose to meet him. When he woke, the garden was gone. The hospital was a place of noise and scrutiny. Documents were checked. Questions were asked. Staff moved in and out, indifferent but observant. For the first time in years, he was not in control of his environment. Lying there, he understood the danger clearly. Medical records created trails. Backgrounds were verified. Conversations happened without him present. The role he had built depended on physical capability, and now that capability was compromised. Visitors came. The official's wife sat by his bed, genuinely concerned. The kindness unsettled him more than suspicion would have. Later, the man he had served for so long arrived briefly. There was no anger in his voice, only practicality. Recovery would take time. Heavy labor would no longer be possible. A replacement would be needed. It was said calmly, almost kindly. With that, 14 years of access ended not with arrest, but with irrelevance. When he left the hospital, he returned not to the estate, but to uncertainty. The cottage that had been his shelter was no longer his. The routines that had protected him were gone. He was, once again, just another man in Moscow, but now without purpose. The operation was finished, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. What remained was the most dangerous phase of all: departure. He followed an old protocol he had memorized years earlier, one he had never expected to use. The signal was subtle, almost invisible, and this time it was answered. Within days, plans were in motion, new documents, a new identity, a narrow window of time. The gardener had survived by being unnoticed. Now, to live, he would have to vanish completely. Leaving Moscow was more dangerous than entering it had ever been. For 14 years, the gardener had survived by remaining exactly where he was expected to be. Now, movement itself was the risk. Every step away from routine created the possibility of attention. Every interaction carried weight. He was no longer protected by invisibility. He was exposed by change. The exit was designed to look ordinary. A man whose health had failed. A worker whose usefulness had ended. Someone seeking opportunity elsewhere, as millions did inside the Soviet system. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Just another quiet departure in a country full of them. The documents he carried told a different story than the one he had lived, but by now that felt familiar. Identities had become tools, not truths. Names were temporary. Survival was not. The crossing happened quickly. Carefully timed movements, trusted intermediaries, a border chosen for efficiency rather than comfort. When he finally stepped beyond Soviet control, there was no moment of triumph. Only a deep, physical exhaustion that reached further than his body. The work, it turned out, was not over. Months of debriefing followed. Rooms filled with analysts, endless questions. Timelines reconstructed from memory. Conversations replayed line by line. What he had once written in fragments was now expanded into full context. Names, moods, implications. Only then did he learn the scope of what he had done. The intelligence gathered from that garden had shaped decisions at the highest levels. It had confirmed suspicions, revealed priorities, exposed vulnerabilities. It had helped policymakers understand not just what the Soviet leadership said publicly, but what they feared privately. The operation had been considered a success long before it ended. That knowledge brought no relief. Returning to ordinary life proved harder than the mission itself. The country he came back to felt unfamiliar, louder, faster. People spoke freely in ways that made him tense. Doors were left unlocked. Conversations happened without caution. He found himself listening for threats that did not exist. Gardening, ironically, was what helped most. Working soil again, this time without pretending, gave him a sense of continuity he could not find anywhere else. The movements were familiar. The silence was honest. There was no one listening, and no one to listen to. Sometimes memory intruded. The estate, the sound of voices drifting through open windows, the weight of knowing that trust had been real, even if it had been misplaced. He thought often of the people he had deceived, not as targets, but as humans who had never imagined the man tending their garden was anything more than what he appeared to be. The Cold War ended years later. Systems collapsed, flags changed. He watched it all from a distance, aware that history had moved on, without acknowledging the quiet work that had fed it information. The story of the operation remained classified. No public recognition, no memoir, no audience. That too was part of the agreement he had made long ago. What remained was ambiguity. He had served his country faithfully. He had done exactly what was asked of him for longer than anyone had expected. The intelligence mattered. The cost had been real. Whether the balance was fair was a question with no clean answer. In the end, the gardener understood something that had taken him 14 years to learn. The most effective espionage does not look like heroism. It looks like routine. It looks like patience. It looks like a man no one ever notices, doing his job perfectly, until the day he disappears.